And the act of moving onward means we pass these signposts. One of them was first leaving Earth. The next one is hanging out on the moon. What's next? The planets. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together. This fragile little world. This fragile little world. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together.
Hello and welcome to Voices from L5, the show where we explore the other side of space supplement. I'm your host Liam Ginty, and today we'll be talking to Bettina Forget, an artist, gallery owner, and hobbyist astronomer whose work merges art and science together. Hello, Bettina.
Hi there, Neil.
How is it going?
Sorry, did I just call you Neil?
I think you did. That's okay.
No, I was looking at the O'Neill cylinders, and I had a little brain fart. Hi there, Liam.
That's fine. We could pretend I'm O'Neill if you want. I'm sure our listeners would be a lot more interested in that, to be honest. Jared O'Neill back from the dead, talking to space artists. So, tell us a little bit about yourself. You run a gallery in Montreal where you host art that discusses science and portrays science in a way that I think is sort of becoming very popular recently. But I don't think I've ever heard of a gallery that displays a lot of this stuff. It's mostly like online when I've seen it.
Yeah, there are not many galleries who show sci-art or science-influenced art, or I'd like to call it art that makes a connection to science. It's basically grew out of my own interest in science and art because my own work is science or astronomy inspired because I'm an amateur astronomer. This is something that is a passion for me, so to combine my passion for art with my passion for astronomy seemed like a pretty obvious thing to do.
Sure.
Though when I first started doing this, there weren't a lot of other artists who were working in that field. But in the last 10 years or so, there are a lot of very interesting artists who are not just looking at science for their aesthetics, where the science isn't just a pretty veneer, but who are really researching and collaborating with scientists and coming up with really fascinating works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've noticed that too, and it's a topic that we've discussed a little bit on the show before, but I feel like we are in the midst of this scientific breakthrough where science is reaching out to all sorts of walks of life and influencing all sorts of people who maybe before wouldn't have been quite so inspired by this message. And a lot of that, I think, is down to things like the internet and outreach programs by NASA and other groups that are just trying to push this idea that science is a part of our lives now, and the effects of science can be felt in every facet of things that we do. And also space in and of itself is a very viscerally pleasing image to a lot of people. A lot of people just like the look of space, and I mean, that goes all the way back to, the Apollo missions where you had astronauts on the moon talking over live broadcasts about how incredible the moon looks, how incredible Earth looks from the moon. So I have noticed this myself, and I'm wondering, how far the effects of that reach. I mean, do you as an artist see, you say you see more people doing art of space and science, but do you think that will extend further? Do you see more galleries in the future? And do you maybe see this science art influencing other aspects of our lives, like the way, buildings and that sort of thing are designed? Do you see it going further?
Yes, absolutely. I think because science has become so much more popularized, like you said, on the internet, but also, like things like the Discovery Channel, where you feel as a regular person that science is not out of your reach. You can do science at home, like people used to do in the 19th century, where you had these sort of amateur or hobby scientists who could make real contributions to science. And now I feel it's gone full circle where you have the maker community who they want to foster collaborations and make the entry level easier to get more involved with technology and science. So it becomes, because it has become so much more accessible, more people get involved, and then more artists become involved and more designers become involved, and they can integrate Arduinos and LED lights and, microwave ovens and whatever. And suddenly you've got this really amazing stuff that's happening.
Right. I mean, you can go out today and buy, a kit to send a balloon out into space and take photos right now. And a lot of people do. A lot of, schools do that with kids. And I'm working on a little project with a balloon, like a space balloon like that now. And I feel exactly the way that you described, that this sort of science is within my grasp that might not have been possible, even 10 years ago.
Yeah. It was just the nerds who were doing it. And,
right.
And science happened in a laboratory. It was very expensive. You would need, an expensive telescope or microscope or gear that you wouldn't know how to use. But now, you can. Just yesterday, I was on Popular Science on their website, and there's an article about this woman who grows leather using kombucha yeasts, and you can grow your own fabric. It's just so outrageous. But it's doable, and I find it fascinating and inspiring and exciting, and I want to go out and now grow my own leather jacket in a vat.
Yeah,
that's not.
It's incredible. It's incredible the way that this, like I said, this sort of quiet revolution has happened, almost without anyone even noticing as well. Evidently you did, which is why you're promoting this sort of thing in your gallery.
Yeah, and I see a lot more engagement with the arts through science. Especially, I'm interested in contemporary art. I don't show the kind of art that is landscape painting or bowl and a fruit or something that is very decorative. The work that I've been showing at Visual Voice for the last 7 years was very cutting edge, very concept driven stuff that you have to think about. And while that is very enriching and a lot of fun, many people had a hard time making a connection, engaging with that kind of art. But since I've started showing more science-based art, people know science. They've been familiar with rockets and with moons and with, hive collapse and those kind of subjects. They're in the news all the time. So to come to an art gallery and see these subjects being interpreted through metaphor by an artist, it gives them a whole different perspective on maybe, colonizing Mars or what to do about the bees than you would normally read in the paper when you're just reading about it just from a science or engineering perspective.
Right,
and it brings a lot more people into the gallery, and I'm having so many fantastic discussions. People stand here for 15 minutes and, we talk about, would you go to Mars on, like they describe on Mars on a one-way trip? And I allowed people to vote. I put up a blackboard and people could vote yes and no.
Oh, wow.
And, that was really fun. And the Nostalgia for the Future exhibition, where we were looking back at looking forward. So we were looking at 1960s artworks of astronomical artists, how they imagined the future way back when. Mm-hmm. And we were discussing about, utopias and dystopias. And people are much more engaged, first of all, with contemporary art, and also because of the subject. It's so familiar to them, and they have so many questions that art can help answer.
And it's almost a little bit like what we're trying to do here at Voices from L5, where we're trying to engage the public on a subject that, perhaps at one point would have been difficult to broach and talk about, but now through all these other mediums we can reach out to people, and the subject here obviously is space settlement, where we want to, the end goal of this show and pretty much everything that I try to do is to convince the public that living in space is one of those goals that is not only attainable, but something that I feel like we should do. And one of the most powerful tools to achieve this goal is things like art and discussing topics that are interesting and engaging to people in ways that the raw engineering and maths side of it isn't necessarily as engaging. I mean, there's a lot of people out there who are very interested in, the very detailed, very specific and spec-orientated view of these topics, and not just in space settlement, but I'm sure there's plenty of people out there who really want to get into the nitty-gritty of the bee collapse disorder that you were talking about before.
Mm-hmm.
But those people aren't necessarily the kind of people that we need to engage. If someone's already super interested in talking about the launch costs of the latest rocket and how that relates to the future of space settlement, we probably don't need to convince that person that we need to be living in space at some point in the future. It's the person who looks at the rocket and says, that's neat, but would respond to someone talking about space settlement with questions about how possible it is and how financially viable it is, and maybe even with some skepticism. That's the person that I find gets won over by art and, visual things like what you're talking about, and also just interesting topics that they may not hear about from the engineering side. And it's just interesting to see a parallel between, the things that you're talking about, the things that you're seeing, and the things that I'm hoping to achieve with what we're doing here. Which sort of brings me to one of the topics I wanted to talk to you about today, which is the way how art has the ability to inspire people and bring people round to a topic of conversation, which I think ties in really strongly with what you're talking about, how you're seeing more and more people interested in these science topics, and so you're seeing more people doing artwork of it. I think that sort of has a circular effect where people are going to see those artworks that you're talking about and become more interested and inspired to look into science and become more acquainted with it. One of the things that I've found in talking to people about space settlement is I can go on forever about how interesting or how beneficial space settlement is for humanity, and talk about solar panels in space providing energy for everyone, and, talk about clean living and the sort of environments that we can create in space, and, the resources we can gather by being up there. But I find the most powerful thing is showing them images of these cylinders that were drawn, painted by Rick Guidance for Gerard O'Neill's books. These beautiful images of these cylinders with these very alien and strange landscapes. And if I point to that and say, that's what I think we should build, and I say this is something that we can do, I see lights come in people's eyes, I see inspiration start just flowing into them. Is this something that you've seen in your gallery? It sounds a little bit like when you're talking about Mars One, that perhaps that could be, it'd be interesting to see someone who is a little skeptical about, something like Mars One going into your gallery and taking a look at the things that you have on display and hearing their opinions on the other side.
Actually, the Mars One show, it was actually the exhibition was called Ground Control, with works by Bill Finger, and he has that whole series where he imagines this person who's prepping to go into space and to say goodbye to the Earth forever. And I had this blackboard up, and I said, it said on the blackboard, would you go to Mars one way? And then you could put a line on yes or on the no side. And the kind of conversations that sparked were just so fascinating, where people were really deeply thinking about what it would mean and why we would go into space. And I kept the running score, and initially I thought, based on the feedback and the discussions that I was hearing in the gallery, that not that many people would be interested. But after a month, I tallied it up, and about 33% have that explorer gene. And what I found interesting is when people voted yes or no, it was immediate. They saw it, they grabbed the chalk, yes. And after that, there was the discussion. But what I feel that demonstrates is that a good chunk of us have this Wanderlust, this feel, this need to discover and to push the boundaries. And I think those are the 33% that we need who drag the rest of us along.
Right. Yeah.
And I also want to mention that this whole idea of exploring new frontiers, it's a very American idea as well. If you look back into the 1900s, when the American West was kind of, discovered for the Europeans. And that was done with the distinct aid of visual artists like Frederick Edwin Church and Albert Bierstadt, who were actually paid by the American government to go out there with their paints and their canvases and then to document, Yosemite Park and the Rocky Mountains. And those paintings would then be brought back to the East and exhibited to inspire more people from the East to, pack their wagons and head out there. So it's this kind of mechanism where you're using artists to inspire the masses to reach for new frontiers. It's not a new idea, and it works really well, as we, can demonstrate, because North America is very well settled by now.
I had no idea about that. That's a new topic to me. That's very interesting. Especially as, space settlement is often compared to the settling of the American West. See, I think that you've touched on a little bit of an interesting subject there, which is in your example, we're talking about people being sent to those locations to create art and show to other people. Mm-hmm. Whereas what we are looking at right now is the vast, vast, vast majority of art done of space is from a human perspective, from, on Earth. Not a human perspective, sorry, that would be
an earthbound perspective.
Right. With perhaps the exception of some NASA videos that have been posted online, and my personal favorite, Chris Hadfield's music video of his version of Major Tom, which he shot on the ISS. Mm-hmm. It was incredible to see, and perhaps I think, and I would like to get some emails correcting me on this, but I think is some of the first, what I would consider artistic depictions of a human in space, living in space in a lot of ways. A lot of that video is the whole video is a beautiful artistic endeavor in and of itself. Visually speaking, it's very beautiful. He makes the environment he's in look incredible and interesting and visually pleasing. But he also, in the video, depicts just parts of his day-to-day life. He modified the song and picked a song that he could express his feelings for leaving this place that was his home. In every sense of the word, it's an artistic expression of his situation. And I think that's the first time that's ever been done in space. A lot of the other images of space and the ISS and videos that NASA have done have been very beautiful, being very, aesthetically pleasing. Especially, the shots of Earth as the ISS goes over it, and shots of astronauts on the ISS. But that Chris Hadfield video is, like I say, it's an expression of emotion and life that he wanted to let everyone know about. And I'm not sure, I think that might be the first time, at least I've ever seen something like that.
Well, there's actually a lot of art that has been sent into space.
Sure.
But that was not art that was not created by people living in space. Mm-hmm. I think that's the distinction you're making, because there are many artists who are interested in art in zero gravity, and I know artists who have sent paintings up to the ISS. Mm-hmm. But it's a whole different story if you are living there and then you're creating an artwork that integrates the realities of your life into the artwork. And that is really what I find fascinating, that perspective, because you can't do this from here.
Right.
It's our art, we mirror our life, we comment on our life and our reality. And all our thoughts and ideas are sparked by our environment. Mm-hmm. So you have a new environment, of course, a whole different cascade of ideas is going to pop into your head and will then express itself.
Right.
And I also think it would be very interesting if you're going to send artists into space, that they would be artists who already have an interest or certain knowledge of science, so they can integrate those two elements. Mm-hmm. Because they would basically be an artist in residence on the space station. I mean, they had lots of different models. I can think about sending an artist into space. We could have somebody like Bierstadt or Church who is paid by NASA and would be then the artist in residence on a space station. Mm-hmm. And their one and only job would be to be aware and to walk around and interpret and comment on the reality of living in space and send that back to Earth to give us down here some sort of idea of what it's like and maybe inspire more people to go into space. But I can also see just regular people who are up there. Maybe there should be an art school so that everybody who is in space finds some sort of way of dealing with the new pressures and new realities of, like we mentioned earlier, no gravity or, some sort of restrictions, and also that immense sense of loss. You no longer have sunsets, and you no longer have, all your friends around you. You're basically just in this little capsule floating above your planet. And I remember astronauts talking about what a big impact it made on them spiritually to look back on the planet. And I think everybody will have a reaction to that, and it may be a good idea to have somebody there who can maybe teach art or facilitate art making for everyone who is up there, so they can, emotionally and mentally deal with their new reality.
Right. And I know NASA is very interested in the psychological effects of living in space and how to mitigate some of the damaging effects that you're talking about there. And I wonder if art therapy is one of the things that were considered by NASA. And I mean, why not? We send all sorts of people with all sorts of disciplines to the ISS to do all sorts of things. And I think it would be definitely a worthwhile thing to explore, sending someone whose main job would be to lead art therapy and do artistic things in space. I think that would be a very interesting thing to look at. But
yes, talking about Chris Hadfield, the reason there's a guitar up there is basically for mental health reasons.
Right.
They had that guitar up there for a while because they realized that people can sort of blow off steam and get grounded again and gain some emotional equilibrium through art, because we're not robots just working in space and executing, EVAs and repairs. We also have to live as human beings, and culture and art is a huge part of that.
Right.
I wonder if that becomes more crystallized and clear once you are in that isolation in space, because here on Earth we take culture so for granted.
Right.
But once you are in this slightly artificial environment, I wonder if people suddenly realize that I really, really need art so I can stay sane and maintain my humanity.
Yeah, I mean, sitting here in my little office, I've got all sorts of artwork and designs and pictures, and not even just necessarily things on the wall, but just things I have around me. The little box that my computer's sitting on right now has, some pretty bland designs on it, but it's still art in some way. It's still something visually pleasing, whereas on the ISS, everything's very utilitarian. Everything's very designed to be worked in and not to please the eye. And I wonder, in Space Settlement, a lot of times we talk about the effects of things like trees on the human psyche, and the effects of, greenery, and how, and a lot of the designs for O'Neill's cylinders, and people that came before and after him, there's intentionally these rolling mountains and trees and forests and parks. Because I think even going back all that way, people realize that if people are going to live in these places for a long period of time, not just the 6 months that an ISS astronaut might have to live with, it becomes downright vital to have some level of pleasing aesthetics. If not necessarily, full-on artistic things in space, you still need something that makes you feel good to look at, and I think that seeing more art in space is something that we probably have to look forward to in the future. If it starts with leaving a guitar on the ISS, maybe the next thing they send up is a couple paintings to hang on the walls, or float on the walls, I suppose.
But I think I want to make a distinction here between the kind of art that is aesthetic and decorative and sort of makes your surroundings look livable, and the kind of art. Not all art is pretty.
Sure.
Art is also, its function is to ask questions and to find metaphors for the human condition so you can look at things that are important in life. And that could be an installation, or it could be a performative piece. It could be data visualization. It could be really anything, especially if you go into sci-art.
Right.
So while I think that aesthetics is very important in our day-to-day life, and it makes our lives so much better, I don't want to reduce art making to that definition.
No, of course. And that's the difference that I was getting at before with the shots from the ISS of the rolling Earth with Chris Hadfield's performance, where the shots of the rolling Earth were very pretty and maybe could make you think about our place in the cosmos and that sort of thing, but were primarily just aesthetically pleasing, whereas I felt like Chris Hadfield's performance was him giving a message about his place, about what he had experienced, about his life on the ISS. And not just in a visually pleasing way, but in a way that made me consider what he must have felt like doing it. There was a lot of sorrow in that video, which I thought was pretty interesting too.
Yeah, it was more sublime. It was beautifully shot and it was aesthetic, but when he spins his guitar in zero G, like those little things that he's really in space. Mm-hmm. It kind of drives it home, and it goes beyond just pretty pictures. Right. It has more of a message, and that's always what I look for. I always look for the content and the artistic work, and not just in how it looks.
Exactly. One of the things that you mentioned earlier was that you would be interested in seeing someone who has a deep understanding of science go into space and intentionally create art and observe, and that would be their job on the ISS. One thing that I would be interested in is sort of the opposite. I would be very interested in art from someone who just lives in space. And this is, far-flung futurism stuff, where we're talking about someone who has been born on an O'Neill cylinder, perhaps, or on a space station, that has been colonized, who grows up with that environment just being where they live, and that environment being their existence. I would be very interested in seeing what the art from that person would look like, because one of the things about art is that it is often, or almost always, I suppose, an expression of something of all of these influences on us. On the influences not just from our experiences, but also our environment colors how we express those experiences. The things that we take for granted on Earth, like gravity and the horizon and mountains and forests and the color of the sky and oceans, all of those things, influence and change how we express ourselves artistically. And what I would be very interested in seeing is how someone who lives in an entirely alien way, not even, even on Mars you have mountains and the horizon and a sky, but on an O'Neill cylinder you don't really have a sky how we think about it. You don't have a horizon in the way that we think about it. You don't even have gravity in the way that we think about it. What do you think I mean, would that be something you would be interested in showing in your gallery, for example, art from L5?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, we could make this an annual show. I would be very interested. I think what you're touching on is the difference between the first generation and the second generation colonist.
Right.
Because if you send up the first generation into the cylinder, they still come with all their luggage, their baggage from Earth, and that expectations to see in horizon and the memory of gravity. And they will be processing a change of experience. Mm-hmm. It's very similar to when you're sending an artist into a new environment for an artist in residence program. Like, for example, I went to Iceland last year and stayed there for a month in northern Iceland. And the whole idea of going there was exactly the change of environment, which then triggers a questioning of the status quo.
Right.
But if you're looking, what you're looking for is somebody who is a second generation space explorer, so somebody who was born there, their status quo is zero gravity and no horizon. And then seeing what their worldview is like, what they take for granted, and what is new to them would be a very interesting. If I'm going to show this in my gallery, I would make it a double exhibition, have a first gen and then a second gen, and see where the differences and where the overlaps are.
It would be interesting to see if that would spawn... I mean, there's a lot of movements in art that were rejections of previous movements. You know, like how you have Cubism and Surrealism rejecting elements of previous movements in artwork. It would be interesting if the second generation of artists on the colony rejected this, whatever the first generation did. You know, perhaps the first generation would draw a lot of, would create a lot of pieces that discussed the differences between the colony and home to them. But the second generation would, as you said, just be living in this place already and would perhaps... It would be interesting to see if that spawned a cultural movement of accepting the space colony for what it was and doing art that just depicts it in and of itself rather than its influences from Earth.
Yeah, I think a second generation would ask a completely new set of questions that are born out of the reality of that new society in space that we can't even predict from our perspective here and now.
Of course. I mean,
and they would also probably invent completely new ways of making art and defining what art is. Because there's a smaller populace. It's probably going to be more homogeneous, maybe, a society. There may be, of course, you have much more restrictions about what is available in terms of art-making materials. So making art may involve completely different processes.
And this is a thing that gets touched on occasionally, but not very in depth. In O'Neill's book, The High Frontier, he very briefly mentions zero gravity ballet as something that he would expect to see on one of his colonies, which I often sort of make a bit of fun of because he just sort of drops this in a big long discussion about the effects of a zero gravity center of a colony, and he just sort of out of nowhere says, and also zero gravity ballet would be possible. Just sort of preposterous in the context, but the idea of the artistic process changing because of all, not just, you know, these influences that we see, but also these restrictions and just in the different way of living that these people would be, you know, forced into. You know, the fact that they would have to deal with different gravity, and the fact that they would have access to zero gravity constantly. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of methods that we use to create art on Earth that just simply wouldn't work in space. And I imagine on a colony they would come up with a whole bunch of ways to create art that just simply aren't possible on Earth.
Yeah, because you always integrate what's in front of you and what is around you when you're making art. And people are incredibly playful as well. So as soon as there's something new, scientists will start to measure and investigate it. Artists will go and try and play with it and interpret it. That's just how human society works. And that is the beautiful thing about having artists on board, because they go out and they play with it. And maybe through that plain experimentation, even new discoveries can be made.
Right. It would be...
Zero gravity ballet already exists.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, there are many choreographers who go out in the Vomit Comet.
Oh.
And, in that couple of minutes that they have of zero gravity, they are choreographers who actually work with that aspect.
Wow.
So, O'Neill isn't that far off. It's not that preposterous.
That's very interesting. Yeah. Hopefully, I'll see if I can look something of that up and post a link with this podcast. It's very interesting. You've given us a lot to think about already. But yeah, I one of the things that I read a little bit in preparation for this show was a man on the Vomit Comet went and he painted a picture on the Vomit Comet. In zero gravity. And one of the little details, the article was mostly talking about how it sold for something like $300,000. But one of the little comments in the article that I thought needed a lot more discussion was how he couldn't use paints, or a certain kind of paint, oil paints I think it said, because the zero gravity wouldn't allow the paint to be usable for a start, but it would also influence how the paint stuck to the canvas.
Yeah.
So he had to do those touch-ups back on Earth, and he had to use pastels on the Vomit Comet because it's the only thing that he could get on hand that would allow him to actually draw. Which I think, again, is incredibly interesting. This idea that this whole new environment not only influences the expression that you're trying to express, but also the method in which that you will be doing it, and I wonder if this is another thing that would separate the first and second generation colonists. The first generation may be trying to use the tools that they're used to on Earth and use them in this environment, and then the second generation embracing these restrictions and discovering all new ways of expressing their art.
Absolutely. And science and technology have always had a huge influence about how art is made.
Right.
Even something basic as the move from tempera colors to oil paints, you see a huge change in artistic expression. It's not that people suddenly became better at painting. It's just it's really, really hard to get a good skin tone or do nice degradation, dégradé in tempera. It's just too opaque and sticky. And you can do that in oil. So already that small change in technology had a huge impact on the way art was made. And that's been keeping going with printmaking, with the introduction of computer technology, and now we have 3D printing. And each time aesthetics, the form of aesthetic expression changes, and new ideas are being introduced, and new aesthetics. So of course, what people would do in space is test all these assumptions, because our default position is, art means a painting. So I need oil paints. So I'm going to start doing that. And then it doesn't work. And then that's what artists are really good at. They're very innovative, and they always think sideways, and they will just take anything, just spontaneously, creatively explore. And they're always questioning the status quo. They always say, well, maybe it's not a painting, or maybe I can just paint on the space station itself, or maybe I'll paint myself, or, and what is it I even want to say? Maybe there's a whole different method of expression. We may see completely new kind of art forms.
Right.
Because what we're seeing right now on Earth even is that all these silos are being broken down. First between artistic disciplines where, you are either a sculptor or a painter, and now you're, like interdisciplinary. And now the silos between art and science are being broken down. So now it's sci-art. So once we're out in space, like who else, everything, maybe everybody's doing everything. It's like going back to the Renaissance where there were no compartments at all.
Right.
And you're questioning everything.
And I mean, you already have a part of that with the video that we talked about a little bit just now, with Chris Hadfield both filling this role of scientist and artist, creating, his own expressions through that. It just occurred to me that I wonder if, you could, I suppose, create magnetic paints. That might be a way to get around the zero gravity issue. Just creating canvases out of some sort of metallic substance and using paints that are magnetic in some way.
Yeah.
That would allow you to at least paint in space.
Well, the problem is the water, right? And you have a hydrophobic support.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the problem of getting paint on canvas, even Helen Frankenthaler, when she did her soak stain technique in the 1960s and 50s with the abstract expressionists in New York, I mean, she was dealing with the same problems. And what she did, you just add soap.
Huh.
And that allows the paint to sink into the canvas.
Right,
so
right.
Artists have always been nearly like alchemists and playing around with their materials, and they're not very linear thinkers, but because of all that crazy brain activity, sometimes they're coming up with really interesting solutions. Those are exactly the kind of people you want in space.
And that in and of itself is a sort of scientific endeavor in a very real way, is discovering these new ways of doing things, which is really the very core of what science is all about. Experimentation and finding new results. We're just about running up on time here. Mm-hmm. And you've given us a lot to think about. A lot of the things that you brought up was something that I didn't know about, and I'm very excited to look into this. Before we go, is there anything you'd like to plug, or anything you'd like to give a shout out to?
Oh, wow. I would like everybody to listen to this podcast to look into sci-art. They are, besides my own gallery, Visual Voice Gallery in Montreal, there are some really fantastic places like the Arts Catalyst in the UK, and GV Arts, and Le Laboratoire in Paris. These are people who are at the real cutting edge of sci-art, and if science interests you and you're kind of interested in art, look into that trend, and I think you will discover really fascinating and challenging artworks that you can really connect with.
And of course, everyone should go right ahead and check out your gallery at www.visualvoicegallery.com.
Absolutely.
Obviously. Thank you again. You've been absolutely fantastic, and like I said, given us a lot to think about.
Well, great. Thank you, Liam. Thank you for getting in touch with me. It was lovely chatting with you.
Hey folks, thanks for listening to the show. If you have any comments, suggestions, or questions, please email me at voicesfroml5@gmail.com. Music for Voices from L5 has been graciously provided by John Boswell of Symphony of Science. Find more of his work at www.symphonyofscience.com. Hey, if you like what we do here and you want to hear more experts from all sorts of fields talking about space settlement in ways that you might not hear anywhere else, consider donating to our Patreon account. We really rely on donations to keep the show going, and even a small donation helps us get better guests, better equipment, and produce a better show for you. We have some great goals in mind for the show, and we'd really like you to make something special. You can check out a link to our Patreon account on the website. Thanks.